It is with a great honor and privilege that I welcome you all today. This is a part one of a series of three parts event. For this session, I am privileged to have Professor Alain, a renowned expert in conflict, humanitarian negotiation, mediation, and leadership, who will deliver a keynote speech. His vast experience as a professor of conflict resolution at Brandeis University, a chair in leadership and negotiation at the European University Institute in Florence, and his role as an affiliate faculty member and executive committee member of a program on negotiation at Harvard Law School makes him a unique learning opportunity for all of us. I hope Professor Alain will leave a lasting impact on your life, just as it did on mine. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francis. I would like to speak about empathy. Francis just, in his gracious introduction, just shared the fact that we love to do simulations or exercises because it's the best way sometimes of experimenting about negotiation or mediation or conflict resolution. So that's how I will start, and I will use an exercise called the lady exercise. So we use this exercise many times in some of the workshops we organized in Burundi. So there would be Hutu and Tutsi people in the room. And so maybe some people on the left, Hutu or Tutsi, would receive this picture. So they would see the young lady. And people, Hutu and Tutsi, who would see this picture would tend to see the old lady. So what was the point of this? Was to say that very often it just take a few seconds to be preconditioned. So what can we learn from the lady exercise? Is that we learn a lot about perception. We learn that sometimes it just takes a few seconds to prime someone, to precondition them, right? And what happens if I have seen the young lady first, I tend to see the young lady in the second picture. If I've seen the old lady first, I tend to see the old lady in the second picture. Perceptions are biased towards either the young lady or the old lady, depending on the preconditioning. If I've seen this first picture, I may not even consider the possibility that there is another lady. I just don't see her. I might think a person, if someone says she's 20 years old, people say that's not possible. There is no, she can only be 80 years old. It's clear she's 80 years old. But then little by little, if we take the time, right, they might recognize this other lady, right? But so often if someone says she's 20 years old, I will think this person is lying. It will take some efforts. It's a process to start seeing this other lady because it was not part of how I was conditioned. It will take some effort, it takes some time, and suddenly the reality in its complexity appears, and suddenly I start seeing the two ladies, right? So I'm sure that if I go back for a second here, right? If I go back to this picture, now you see that the same reality as both the young lady here and the old lady here, right? So that's really the point we are trying to make here, is that it takes time, but it's possible to suddenly start seeing the two ladies, right? But you see, the point is also to say that empathy towards seeing the other's picture, meaning the way the other side sees a reality, requires time and effort. So empathy doesn't come first. It comes second. It's something I need to pause about and really think about. But let's be honest, right? Take the most difficult conflicts nowadays. Take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you could take also the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Very often people are not preconditioned for a few seconds. They could be for months, for years, for decades. So because it is a long-lasting preconditioning, what if I've always been exposed only to either the young lady or the old lady, right? Just by analogy, see what I'm talking about is that for years I've been told something, and that's the way the things are, right? And nobody has ever even told me, considered that they could be this other lady part of that picture. What if the media, the social media that I'm exposed to only present one side of the reality? It may be harder for me to deconstruct my perceptions. And what it is that my perceptions becomes the only reality. That's what sometimes Leros calls naive realism. My views is the view. Right? My truth is the truth. I can even hardly imagine an alternative perspective on the reality. It may take even more time and effort to let this other lady enter my world, right? And so empathy doesn't come first. It takes energy and effort. It might even take more energy and more efforts if I've been preconditioned to see the world only on one side of the picture. What about perceptions in conflict? And you may just want to think, just make an experiment. Think about a recent dispute, conflict you have been in, right? Could be with your significant other, your spouse, your colleague, your boss. And just think about it for a second, right? And think about what was happening in the middle of that conflict. Not what you think about it now, but during the conflict, during the fight. Who was right? Was it you or the other? What was happening in your head at that time? Well, there's a tendency in a situation like this to believe that I'm more right than the other. And who was wrong? Of course, it's you or the other. No, it tends to be the other. In general, in a conflict, I tend to believe the other is more wrong than me. So conflicts show that whenever I'm in a dispute with someone, in the heat of the conflict, I will tend to blame the other, to accuse them. That's what Keith Allred calls the accuser's bias. If something is going wrong, I will accuse the other side. Not only I will accuse the other side, but I will tend to believe I didn't do anything wrong. I will tend to excuse myself. It's called the excuser's bias. And it goes, you see, it goes at the same time. The same way I blame you, I will consider and I will excuse myself. But you see, what is also interesting is it's exactly what the other side does. If you have two children, or right, you maybe one complains about the other and accuses the other, and then the other side said, no, it's not true, they did it. And at the end, everyone accuses each other and excuses themselves. So you see, that's the conflict aspects, right? And in the middle of a conflict, you will increase naive realism, right? This belief that my perception of the world reflects the way the world is, that it is unbiased. Perceptions in conflicts, think about that also, right? What now if my group has been fighting with some other groups for years and decades, right? What if in my worldview, I've always associated the other group to bad impact? I see this other group and its members as perpetrators of aggression. And I have many examples, daily examples of that. I see my group and its members as victims of their aggression, needing self-defense. And here you have another bias that is going on here. It's within my group is always good. The odd group is always bad. My group is always right. And whenever my group does something that could be questionable, I will attribute that to bad consequences, or to the circumstances, to bad luck, to an error. I'll say it's an error. We didn't do that on purpose. But of course, when the other side, the other group does something wrong, that immediately I will attribute bad faith, a fault to them. So you see, what happens here is that what people do ends up not being as important as who is doing it, right? A murder is a murder. Well, a murder is a act of self-defense if my group does it. And of course, if you do it, you are the worst person in the world, your group also, right? So you see, when they do something, it can only be bad, and they meant it. And that's what also Lee Ross called reactive evolution. I will always blame you for everything. I will disqualify, undervalue any concession, any compromise you make. And when I do something, it can only be right. I will always overvalue my moves, imagine or amplify their goodness. All of that is, of course, has terrible consequences if you think about this. Humans, right, are entrenched each of them in their world of perceptions. This world exists from this I perspective. In the first place, what I experiment is what I experiment. It's only through efforts that suddenly I need to decenter myself, right? But my perceptions tend to be self-centered. Some of these perceptions, like the lady exercise, might be short-lived. Others might be long-lasting. But some perceptions are more individual, some are more collective. But what is interesting is to really notice that the sum of all the perceptions of a human being create their worldviews, so, right? If I've always been exposed to the same images, the same aspects in the world, that will be integrated in my psychology, in my sociology, right? In my view of things, right? It will, and so my perceptions create my worldview, and my worldview will also reinforce my perceptions. So you see, everyone more or less is living in their own world, that the entire world, and then you have these two worlds living in parallel, right? And as we see from what we just talked about, is that conflicts will exacerbate these clashes of worldview, which explains why you see it's my worldview against yours. It's the I versus you in any conflict. But now, if it's a group fighting another group, a nation fighting another nation, is our worldview against theirs. It's the famous us versus them situation. So what about empathy then? Well, you see, empathy is in bad shape. What do you want? It's the reality of what naturally, you see, by nature, we cannot expect necessarily so much empathy, right? Because humans are biased. I will tend to be biased towards myself and towards my group. And of course, if we are looking for empathy here, right, that's why I call this presentation empathy for better or worse, it will not come naturally at first sight. And the empathy I have towards others and towards the other group will be limited. And you see, I have to force myself in order to bypass my first nature. I need to let in additional perceptions to complement my initial ones. And you see, that requires additional skills. It doesn't come naturally. I need to develop good habits. These good habits somehow will create this second nature, which will expand my first nature. See, the point is, by nature, people are not developing so much empathy. It's somehow, and some people show more natural empathy than others. But naturally, we may not be empathetic beings. We may become empathetic beings. And I have developed maybe more empathy towards some people, maybe people of my family have more empathy. So if someone is sick in my family, I care a lot more about this than if someone is far away that I don't see them. So what is empathy? Well, because I could have said that much earlier, right? But empathy comes from originally from German, which is Einfühlung. Right? It's really, you see, in the word empathy, there is the word pathy, which comes from pathos in Greek. And if you look at the second book of the Rhetoric by Aristotle, it's just about that. If you want to convince someone, Aristotle says, you really need to understand where they are coming from, their emotions. You need to touch their emotions. Calier, who is an author of the 18th century and an ambassador, he said you need to put yourself in the other person's, in their place, right? If you want to convince the king, you need to understand what the king is feeling, his prejudices. You need to put yourself in the other place. That's often what we talk about when we talk about empathy. But you see, there are two dimensions of empathy. One aspect, which we just talked about, is really getting the other's emotion. That's affective empathy. I feel your pain when you are going through a difficult time. If you lose a member of your family, I feel for you. That's affective empathy. It's sometimes even sympathy. I feel with you. But you see, it's different from the way sometimes we define it is cognitive empathy. I can understand your beliefs, your views. There is not necessarily an understanding of emotions. For example, if you are an hostage negotiator, you need to develop cognitive empathy and so affective empathy, right? Understand what the other side is feeling, but also understanding their worldviews, where they are coming from. So empathy supposes a process of decentering, overcoming my first nature and its perception, which is extremely difficult because that's what is framing me. It's what is determining me. Decentering means going away from the tendency to be the center, to being self-centered, stepping back, listening, turning down the internal voice, introducing viewpoints and feelings of the other. See, all of that is not natural. It is a second nature, right? Because I allow their perceptions to be part of myself. What is the most natural form of empathy? Maybe the first one is self-empathy. You could, it's nearly the same meaning as self-awareness. What is self-empathy? It's, you see, let's say that there's anger, suddenly I'm become aware of my anger. That's self-awareness, self-empathy, right? I know the perception that I have and how these perceptions from the outside affect me inside. Affect me. I know what I like or not, what is pleasurable, not what is joyful, not. So self-empathy or self-awareness is the capacity for a person to name or express what they feel, whatever it is. But let's be careful, because self-empathy sometimes could lead to self-pity. What is self-pity? It's different from self-awareness, right? Because it's very tainted negatively, right? It's a tendency to only feel bad about what affects me badly, to overemphasize myself as a victim. I'm the victim, I'm the only victim, not seeing the rest of the world or of my world. It could lead to feeling of persecution, paranoia. And you see that self-pity very often is a regression towards a self-centered first nature. Self-pity very rarely includes empathy towards anything else, right? And certainly not the other side. So let's look at empathy in a conflict. What kind of empathy do I have towards the other side? Well, I'm afraid in a conflict, there is a decrease of empathy, as we talked about. Already, I have less empathy towards the other in general than I have through self-empathy. A conflict will decrease my empathy to the point of antipathy, right? That I don't like them, right? It will reduce my capacity to see the other. I will not be able to empathize towards someone who wrongs me, who wrongs mine, the people around me. It will grow the risk of undervaluing the other side, accusing them. And that's where we have irrational low levels of empathy, to the extent of dehumanizing the other side. Anything can be done to the other side. Their children could be killed. Well, I would feel terrible if some of my children are killed, and it seems to not affect me if their children, right? That's what I would call the 0.0 of empathy. So you see, in a conflict, empathy could be reduced so much that it's a self-regression towards an absolute selfish self, a self without any type of empathy. So you see, in conflict towards the other side, there is what I would call the law of atrophy of empathy. Atrophy. Empathy towards the other side and their group, my enemy, drops as the conflict intensifies. So you see, what you have is you have the fact that the intensity of conflict and empathy towards the other side are inversely proportional. The lower the conflict intensity, the higher may be the possibility of empathy. But as conflict rises, empathy lowers. So if you are a little bit mathematical, you would express, so let's say that you are here at the beginning, then the conflict increases. You see, the conflict increases. As the conflict increases, the intensity of empathy decreases, and it tends to zero. So we are always surprised to see that the same acts committed against the other side seems not to awaken my self-empathy. And of course, this depends on people, right? This might depend on people, but that's a general tendency. And what about the empathy towards my side in a conflict like this? It's just the opposite, if you think about this. I will increase the empathy towards my side. I am flooded with images of our suffering, right? So of course, I will love and pity my side increasingly. The empathy towards my side or my group will skyrocket in a situation. It will reach also irrational high levels in this case, to the extent of idealizing our heroes, of not accepting any criticism of our heroes, right? Whatever they do, I will support badly. And you see here in that increase of empathy towards my side, right? I abandon myself to the group. So you have a law of hypertrophy of empathy, because the empathy will increase towards my side in a conflict situation, which will be proportional, right? If conflict rises, empathy grows. If conflict is lower, maybe self-empathy grows, right? So you see here, the graphic is that as the conflict intensifies, my empathy towards my side grows nearly towards infinity. So we have a few laws of empathy in a conflict situation, which is not a good news, but that's the way we observe it very often, right? So again, on the left here, you have the intensity of empathy, how much more or less empathy I have, and the intensity of the conflict on this graphic. So we already saw there is the law of hypertrophy magnified my empathy towards my side. And of course, I get it nearly towards zero towards the other side. But then there is something that is very interesting, isn't it? That's exactly what the other side does, right? If you, whoever, right? Think about Israelis and Palestinians, right? They do exactly the same. Meaning what? Meaning that the same way one side magnifies their empathy towards their side, that's exactly what the other side does. They also magnify their heroes, right? And the same way we dehumanize on one side, we dehumanize on the other side. Well, you see, that's an equal, it's nearly, I would say this is a new law. It's the law of mirroring, very inspired by what René Girard said, right? In a conflict, both sides do exactly the same. They put the other side down without empathy and put their side up with too much empathy. Right? But they do it on both sides the same way. So how do we summarize this? That's what I would summarize. All of these laws, right, come to one, the law of selective empathy in a situation of conflict.
Are you ready to become the change you want to see in your community or in your workplace? If so, check out our tailored workshops and mediation skills, training, and certifications designed to equip you with the practical skills to become an effective conflict resolver and a certified mediation practitioner. Now, let's get back to the show.
So is there any way, maybe during the last 4 or 5 minutes, is there any way of, because it's a very dark picture that I give you. Basically what I'm saying, it is totally normal, human, that in a conflict, and especially when it is group conflict, violent group conflict, right? The empathy towards the other side is quasi zero, and the empathy towards my side is infinite. Is there any way of re-injecting empathy in a conflict situation somehow with the other side, right? And that's why I want to say a few words about mediation, because mediation is a strange process, because it's re-injecting empathy towards the other side. What does that work, right? It works from a starting point when parties are at a zero level of empathy, of quasi zero level of empathy towards one another, right? So what is mediation here? Well, it will bring back some empathy, but as a second nature, right? The process of mediation itself is structured in order to fuel this empathy. So first, there is the immediate empathy of the mediators towards both sides, the benevolence, the fact that they will try to show the same respect. They will show the same respect towards both sides. They will not take side. They will be impartial. They will not take sides on content. They will remain neutral, right? And there is another level. What is interesting, by doing that, they will also gain, there will be some kind of progressive empathy, if the process goes well, of each party towards each other. How does that work? How do you move in a mediation empathy to try to move away from these selfish, unaccommodating selves? Well, taking party where they are in their self-righteousness, you bet on serving them better. How do you do that? Well, each party starts with their own narrative that they, by naive realism, thinks this the only true narrative. And what you see, what mediators do, they will make sure that both narratives are heard. Does that mean they reach a joint narrative? Not necessarily. There is this great book by Khalil Shikaki and Shai Feldman showing working on a conflict is of course, trying to identify some joint narratives, but also living with separate narratives on some questions, right? It's not simply about narratives. It's also about positions. Very often parties come with their positions. You do what I want, and that's the deal. But each party does that, right? So the work we have done, right, the program of negotiation in many places around the world, that's what Francis referred to, the win-win approach, right, to negotiations or mediation is that you will really search for motivations and interest and acknowledge them on both sides. And moving away from only my yes counts to getting to a yes that's the yes of both, searching for mutually agreeable solutions. So you see, there is this decentering process in mediation, but that is operating for both sides. It's a double decentering process. Each side needs to pause from time to time its self-centered selves, its narratives, its perceptions, right? Each has to listen somehow to the other side's narrative. They don't like it in the first place, but they could learn from it. And they could also learn that some of the interests that the other side has are relevant and might be bridged by finding the right solutions, right? So you see this, that what is interesting from mediation can start at the position of dehumanizing, because it will progressively help parties rediscover the other side as a human being, right? The identity is back in the story. So mediation is not simply an interactive problem-solving process. It's also a system of acknowledgement of both identities. So, for example, in my book, what I showed is that when parties, unhappy parties, as you could tell, go through the portal of mediation, they will have two stages. A first stage when they will try to go from their little limited stories. When you see, that's the story of party A, that's the story of party B. It's totally divisive. My truth, your truth, and I'm right, you're wrong, and also their stories, I'm right, you're wrong, and of course, as party A tells their story, progressively, a little bit of that's the story of A enters the story of B, and a little bit of the story of B enters the story of A. And so what happens here, right, is that if in that first phase, when you look at the past, who is right or wrong, right, you start moving to, and what, in a way, both of or visions of the reality were in some ways right. It's the young and the same, you see, it's like the picture of the young old lady together. What mediation is a process when everyone starts with the young and old, and progressively, as you put this reality together, it puts together a broad reality. And that's our story. And of course, you see the intersection is minimal, but somehow there are some joint narratives here. And somehow all stories that there is my story and your story. It must not be the same story. We can live with different views of what happened. We have a bigger story. And you see here, you have a double empathy that operated. When that's done, I start also identifying in the present moment what is important for my side, what is important for the other side, at the part. And of course, if you're a mediator, you help these interests to surface, and you try by all means to get these interests, motivations acknowledged by both sides. Then you're ready to the second stage, which is, how do we go from now that I understand better how you see the world and you understand better how I see the world, that I understand more what is important to you and you understand better what is important to me. How do we move from there to the future? Well, as you remember, most parties, what they want is that the other side does exactly what they want. That's their positions. It's what we call positional bargaining. And it's also, there's a wall between the two, right? There's a wall. It's division again. It's a little transaction, right? Do what I say, and the other says exactly the same. So what are we looking? And you see these Archimedes in this bath trying to find the solution, right? Well, the solution is that an agreement. What is an agreement? It's a set of solutions where some solutions really fit what is important for party A, and some other solution fit for what is important for party B. And there are also solutions that are actually good for both. And you see, it depends, right? We don't need to, you see, it's not simply the common ground that provides solution. No, there are things, take the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there are solutions that will be really good for Palestinians, solutions that are really good for Israelis, and solutions that are really good for both. That's our agreement. And again, it's based on double empathy. So how do I summarize this? Empathy. Well, empathy has at its core something we need to take into account. It's our first nature, the fact that humans are biased, right? They are self-centered. They tend to have limited empathy, and in the worst situation, zero empathy, especially in situations of conflict. Empathy requires to go into that second nature. It's a decentered process that requires an effort and time. And as we know, let's be very much aware that empathy tends to decrease towards zero. That's the law of atrophy, right? Towards the other side, and tends to grow tremendously towards my side. And there's the law of negative mirroring we talked about, and also the law that summarizes the three previous laws, the law of selective empathy. What is, and just as an open window, right, to get us back from this very dark of empathy for the worse, what would be empathy for the better approach, right? It's mediation. Mediation really can help. It could re-inject of that second nature. It's a process of double empathy. When there is mutual decentering, I need to decenter myself, so does the other side as a party, and I need to enter their world, they need to enter my world. So, and we do that both on both sides, mutual decentering and re-entering. So the way mediation works is that a little bit of me gets into them, a little bit of them gets into me, and that actually could be one way of getting empathy back in a situation where there is very little, at least towards the other side. So if I had to summarize this, I would believe that if parties search well, even in the worst conflict, right, both of them can recover a minimum of empathy towards the other side. So I didn't want to leave you with the impression that the future is dark. The future has its brightness, and out of what looks like even sometimes the most intractable conflicts, there are sometimes ways of finding some light. That's and I see some of my friends who are also part of the who are invited here, and I know that's what they do often in their work daily. So thank you for your attention. I hope, Francis, that I respected the time for the questions from our audience.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can support us by leaving a 5-star review. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast to stay informed whenever we upload a new episode. See you in the next episode.